Imagine giving up your friends, your family, your health, and sacrificing every part of your life for a chance to achieve your greatest dream. You spend years dreaming of making it to Formula One. And when, after so many sacrifices, you finally achieve it, all of a sudden everything comes to an end. Because in Formula One, not all dreams come true. Promises that died before they even began. Legends who gave their lives on the track, and champions who never got to lift their trophy. The worst part is that many didn't die because of their own mistakes. They died because of poorly designed cars, unsafe circuits, incomprehensible decisions. They died because of a category that often didn't protect them. Today, you're going to relive the most heartbreaking tragedies that forever marked Formula One. So absurd and so avoidable that they still hurt today as if they happened yesterday. Some you probably know. Others are about drivers whose names you've never heard, but who deserve to be remembered. Because this is also a way to honor them, to not forget them, to tell what they lived through and what they should never have experienced. And they all have something in common. Their stories ended too soon, and they should never have ended that way. So stay until the end to commemorate each one of them today. After a terrible start to his career, everything seemed to start working out for Riccardo Paletti. But no one could have imagined the tragedy that was about to happen. In 1982, during his first season in Formula One, Paletti tried to start his first Grand Prix, but in his first 4 races, he didn't even manage to qualify. And it was only in San Marino where finally things improved. And although he didn't achieve anything extraordinary with a 13th place, he crossed the finish line for the first time in his career. That was his real debut, but even so, he couldn't start again in the next 3 races. But in Canada, everything changed. Finally, he had a new opportunity to show what he was capable of. What he never imagined was that just a few seconds later, everything would turn into a tragedy. At the restart, Didier Pironi, who was starting from pole, was stuck in his place after a mechanical failure. And then this happened. Paletti was coming from behind and couldn't avoid him. He hit the Ferrari at more than 180 kilometers per hour, so the front part of the Osella was destroyed. Pironi, who came out unscathed, was one of the first to run toward Paletti's car. But the fuel tank broke in the impact and a fireball engulfed the car. The crash was so violent that the steering barrier was embedded in his chest, crushed his thorax, and left him unconscious. Because of that, the driver stayed in the car. He only got out when doctors helped and finally managed to remove him. He still had vital signs, but the internal injuries were too severe. He died shortly after in the hospital, not because of the burns, but due to the initial impact to his chest. Thus, the life of Riccardo Paletti came to an end at just 23 years old. And unfortunately, he was not the youngest driver on this list, nor was it the most tragic case. In Formula One, there are deaths that hurt and others that simply should never have happened. Helmut Koenig was just starting to build his path in the category. And although he hadn't achieved any significant results, he was beginning to make a name for himself. But at the 1974 United States Grand Prix, everything ended in the most brutal way anyone could imagine. During the first laps, Koenig lost control of his car due to a mechanical failure. And then that happened. The barrier, poorly installed and with a dangerous design, had already shown serious flaws the previous year, but incredibly, it was still there unchanged. The lower part gave way upon impact, but the upper part did not. The car went underneath and the upper part of the barrier instantly decapitated Koenig. The impact was so brutal that there was no time to attempt a rescue. The most tragic thing is that if the organizers had replaced the barrier with one that met safety standards, this wouldn't have happened. Helmut Koenig was only 25 years old and his Formula One career ended before he even had a real chance. An absurd tragedy caused by a mistake that could have been avoided. Ronnie Peterson was not only one of the fastest drivers in the world, but also one of the most beloved. But in Monza in 1978, his story ended in the most painful way possible. During practice, he had an accident that forced him to race with a car from the previous year. But not only that, the accident left him with injured legs, an old car, and his body already battered. Everything seemed like a sign that things were not going to end well. In the restart, a massive accident broke out. Peterson was hit and his Lotus crashed into the wall, shattering. The car caught fire and he was trapped among the wreckage. James Hunt, Clay Regazzoni, and Patrick Depailler got out of their cars to pull him out before he suffered serious injuries from the fire. They managed to do it and left him on the ground. Conscious, he was talking, he was awake. And up to that moment, it seemed like everything was going to be fine, that there was no real danger. However, at the hospital, the doctors informed him that he had 27 fractures, and after discussing it with him, they decided to operate to stabilize his bones. At first, the operation went well, but as the hours passed, his body started to fail. The internal injuries were more severe than expected, and his organs began to fail one after another. A few hours later, he passed away. Unfortunately, the process was not quick. It was a slow and painful death, and although he fought against the suffering, he did not survive. Rodney Peterson was only 34 years old and died waiting for a recovery that never came. Pierce Courage was seen as one of the most promising talents of his generation, but at the 1970 Dutch Grand Prix, everything changed in an instant. The car he had to drive had a problem. It was heavy, hard to control, and not very competitive. To compensate, Frank Williams' team decided to lighten it by using magnesium components, an extremely flammable material, a detail that will be important later on. During the race, in one of the fastest sections of the circuit, Courage lost control of his single-seater, which had sustained damage. The car could no longer turn and went straight out of control, violently hit an embankment, flipped over, broke apart, and instantly caught fire. The impact was so brutal that one of the tires flew off and struck him on the head, causing fatal injuries to his neck. It is believed that Courage died at that moment, even before the fire consumed what was left of the car. However, that fire was not normal. The magnesium parts burned with uncontrollable intensity, fueling the flames until they reached the nearby trees and bushes. No one could get close. Not the marshals nor the firefighters. Nothing could be done, and despite what happened, the race continued. The worst part is that the accident was even more deadly because of the magnesium modifications that had been made to the car. Irresponsibly, instead of protecting him, they turned it into a death trap. A tragic end for a race that had just begun, and another promise lost too soon at just 28 years old. But if Courage was a promise lost too soon, the next driver was not just a promise, he was the future. Francois Sévère was destined to be the next world champion. He was Jackie Stewart's protege and the natural heir of Tyrrell, a driver with talent, charisma, and everything ahead of him. But at the 1973 United States Grand Prix, his story ended in the cruelest way anyone could imagine. During qualifying, Sévère was fighting for pole position, but he lost control in the S's, and this happened. His car lightly touched the curbs, which destabilized it, causing him to swerve sharply and hit the barriers. Afterwards, he bounced, crossed almost the entire track, and crashed on the other side at an angle of nearly 90 degrees. The barrier lifted and intruded into the front part of the car right where he was. Sévère, who died instantly from fatal injuries that split his body in half, was only 29 and his future was just about to begin. In addition, Jake Stewart had secretly decided to retire at the end of that season, which meant that Sévère was going to be the new leader of Tyrrell starting the following year. But the death was so devastating that the team withdrew from the Grand Prix and Stewart never raced his 100th race. There was no farewell, only an impossible void to fill. Sévère was a star who never had the chance to shine, all that he promised in a future that Formula One never got to know. Jules Bianchi was more than a promise. He was the future of Ferrari. He was 25 years old in a career that was just beginning to take off. But at the 2014 Japanese Grand Prix, that future was broken forever. The rain wouldn't stop, the track was getting more and more slippery, and on lap 42, Adrian Seudel lost control of his car and crashed into the barriers. Because of this, a crane came in to remove his Sauber without the safety car being deployed. Even though the conditions were extremely dangerous, the track was soaked, visibility was low, and there was heavy machinery in the middle of the circuit. Incredibly, only yellow flags were shown, a totally irresponsible decision. And one lap later, in the same place, Bianchi lost control, slid on the wet asphalt, and crashed into the crane at 126 km/h. The impact was sharp, with no explosion, but brutal. Bianchi was left unconscious, suffered severe head injuries, and was rushed to the hospital where he was placed in an induced coma. He remained like that for 9 months. 9 months of waiting, 9 months without answers, until finally, on July 17, 2015, his family confirmed his passing. It was the first death in Formula One in more than 2 decades. And it wasn't caused by speed or a driving mistake, but by negligence that could have been easily avoided. A chain of bad decisions that ended the life of a young driver. The death of Jules Bianchi was one of the most heartbreaking losses in the history of Formula One, and it should never have happened. Unfortunately, this wasn't the only time a driver died due to the organization's irresponsibility. And, believe me, it keeps getting worse. But before we continue, subscribe. Lorenzo Bandini was one of the crowd favorites. His close relationship with Ferrari and his daring style had made him a very beloved man in Formula One. But at the 1967 Monaco Grand Prix, his story ended in the most devastating way possible. Bandini was fighting for the victory on the streets of Monte Carlo when he lost control at the harbor chicane. And this happened. The Ferrari crashed into the safety barriers, flipped over, and caught fire. Immediately, the car ended up upside down and Bandini was trapped among the wreckage as the flames engulfed him. All of this happened in front of the horrified eyes of the public, and with cameras broadcasting it live to the whole world. Even so, he managed to be rescued alive, but he had burns on more than 70% of his body. And that's when the real tragedy began. For 3 days, Bandini fought to survive. 3 days of extreme pain, medical interventions, constant suffering, and a tense weight that paralyzed all of Italy. Finally, after those 3 days of unbearable agony, Bandini passed away at the age of 31, and a race in which he was fighting for victory ended up being his last. This was one of the most painful deaths Formula One has ever experienced, not only because of how it happened, but because of everything he suffered. Roger Williamson was one of the young prospects in Formula One and was only competing in his second race in the championship. And it was at that 1973 Dutch Grand Prix where everything ended in the most tragic way possible. During the race at Zandvoort, he suffered a mechanical failure at high speed, and this happened. One of the tires blew out. The car hit the wall and slid for 275 meters until it ended up upside down against the barriers. Additionally, the car caught fire while it was still sliding on the track. Williamson was not unconscious, nor had he been seriously injured. He was alive and was heard screaming desperately for help.
It took emergency services 8 minutes to arrive, an eternity.
But no one did anything. At first, the commentators, race control, and even some drivers assumed that the accident had happened to another racer and that he had already escaped unharmed. So everything continued as normal, and while the race went on, Roger Williamson was suffocating from the smoke. The only one who stopped was his friend David Purley. He jumped out of his car in desperation, ran toward the fire, and tried to go back. He was the one who used the extinguisher to try to put out the flames. Without a fireproof suit, without equipment, without help, and without time. In fact, one of the marshals even tried to keep Purley away from the scene as if everything was under control, but obviously it wasn't. Not a single one came closer to help while they listened to Williamson's desperate screams. Meanwhile, some spectators tried to jump the fences to intervene, but they were stopped by the security staff. And as if that wasn't enough, the fire truck took 8 minutes to arrive, but by the time it showed up, it was already too late. Williamson didn't die from the accident. He died from smoke inhalation, trapped alone and begging for help. A slow death, while the whole world watched. At just 25 years old, he suffered one of the most unfair tragedies this sport has ever seen. And the worst part is that Roger Williamson could have survived, but he was the victim of a chain of unforgivable mistakes. Jochen Rindt was about to be crowned world champion and was the man dominating the 1970s season with unstoppable aggression. He had won 5 of the first 8 races and no other driver was close to catching him. Everything indicated that he was about to reach glory, but at Monza, his fate changed forever. During a practice session for the Italian Grand Prix, his car suffered a mechanical failure at over 250 kilometers per hour, lost stability. And this happened. The car veered out of control and crashed head-on into a metal barrier. One of the anchors broke, the front part of the Lotus got stuck underneath, and the impact completely destroyed the front of the car. Rindt was wearing his safety harness without the crotch strap, a common practice to escape faster in case of fire, and that caused him to slide under the belt. The impact was brutal, and he died before reaching the hospital. He was only 28 years old. The most tragic thing is that just a few days earlier, he had seriously considered retiring. The deaths of his friends, Bruce McLaren and Pierce Courage, had deeply affected him, and he was no longer thinking only about himself. He was thinking about his daughter. He wanted to be there for her. But unfortunately, he never got to make that decision. The season went on, but no one managed to surpass him in points. And so Jochen Rindt became the first and, to this day, the only world champion crowned posthumously. A title without a podium, without celebration, and a champion who never got to see his own crowning. But that wasn't the worst part, because later investigations confirmed that it wasn't just a mechanical failure, but a poorly installed safety barrier. That sealed his fate. So, like several of the cases we've seen throughout this video, his death could have been easily avoided. But unfortunately, this wasn't the last one. And now, if you're finding this video interesting, subscribe. Joe Schlesser had spent his whole life fighting for this moment. And after 2 decades competing in all kinds of categories and making all kinds of sacrifices, finally at 40 years old, he achieved what he wanted most: to debut in Formula One with an official car of the category. But what was supposed to be the beginning of a dream ended in a terrible tragedy. At the 1968 French Grand Prix, Honda decided to put him behind the wheel of the RA 302, an experimental prototype built with an extremely flammable magnesium chassis. A car that was not ready to compete. A car that John Surtees, world champion in 1964 and Leeser's teammate, had described as a death trap. And just on the second lap of his first race, Schlesser lost control. In a fast corner, the car hit an embankment, flipped over, and instantly and brutally caught fire. The magnesium burned with such violence that the fire was impossible to contain. Schlesser was trapped in the flames, had no chance to escape, and died before anyone could help him. Incredibly, the race was not stopped. The remains of the car stayed on the asphalt while everything continued as if nothing had happened. Finally, John Surtees went up to the podium without knowing that the man who had died was his own teammate. What Honda did was so despicable. Shortly after, Surtees left the team. And the scandal was so great that the Japanese brand also left the category. That's how the dream ended for a man who sacrificed everything to reach Formula One and lost his life because of his own team's irresponsibility by putting him in a car that should never have touched the track. Gilles Villeneuve was much more than a driver for Ferrari. He was the chosen one to become one of the greatest legends in the team's history. But at the 1982 Belgian Grand Prix, that very special bond was broken forever. During qualifying, Villeneuve had only one goal: to beat his teammate Didier Pironi. He hated him. But on that last attempt at a fast lap at full speed, he came across Jochen Mass in a fast corner, a car that was going much slower. And then this happened. The Ferrari lifted off and shot out at over 200 km/h. It crashed into the ground several times, and after the last impact, Gilles, still strapped to his seat, was catapulted out another 50 meters until he crashed into the barriers. The marshals found him among the wreckage without his helmet and with fatal injuries to his neck. He was taken to the hospital immediately while his wife traveled to be with him, but unfortunately there was nothing more that could be done. Villeneuve lived under the conviction of achieving victory at any cost, but it was that conviction that cost him his life. That is how one of the greatest talents Formula One has ever seen passed away. A tragedy that will be remembered forever. The 1960 Belgian Grand Prix was one of the darkest weekends in the history of Formula One. In a matter of minutes, two young drivers lost their lives in a brutal and unexpected way at the Spa-Francorchamps circuit. First, Chris Bristol, just 22 years old, lost control of his Cooper in one of the fastest sections of the track. And this happened. He crashed into an embankment. He was thrown from his car and, in a scene as horrible as it was shocking, died decapitated when he landed on a barbed wire fence. But unfortunately, that wasn't all. 5 laps later, the second tragedy occurred. Alan Stacey also lost control of his car. It's believed he was hit in the face by a bird while driving at over 200 kilometers per hour. The car shot off the track, flipped over, and instantly caught fire. Stacey was trapped inside the car and burned to death without anyone being able to help him. He was only 26 years old. 2 deaths in the same race, 2 young lives lost in minutes, and a brutal demonstration of how fragile Formula One was in those years. This was the first time that 2 drivers died during the same Grand Prix, but unfortunately it was not the last. Tom Pryce was one of the greatest prospects in Formula One. With his natural talent and aggressive style, many saw him as a future champion. But at the 1977 South African Grand Prix tragedy struck him in the most absurd and chilling way. On lap 22, Renzo Zorzi's car stopped at the side of the main straight and caught fire, but the driver managed to get out on his own. Despite the smoke and having a car stopped at the side of the track, no yellow flag was shown and the race continued as if nothing had happened. At that moment, 2 very young marshals without authorization or training decided to cross the track to try to put out the fire, carrying 18-kilogram fire extinguishers with them. But the second one was hit head-on by Tom Pryce's car. The impact was brutal. The marshal's body was thrown through the air, landed several meters ahead, and died instantly at just 19 years old. And as if that wasn't enough, the fire extinguisher he was carrying struck Pryce directly on the head, also causing him an immediate death. With Pryce already lifeless but his foot still on the accelerator, his car continued out of control for more than 700 meters, went off the track, crashed into an emergency entrance, and ended up hitting the car of Jacques Lafitte, and both ended up crashing into a concrete wall. Lafitte, who was unharmed, approached Pryce's car but was horrified when he saw the condition his colleague was in. A chilling, unnecessary, and completely avoidable scene. Worst of all, the race continued despite the tragedy that had just occurred. Tom Pryce was only 27 years old when he lost his life due to a chain of mistakes, negligence, and poor organization. A situation that Formula One should never have allowed. This is how the 2 most absurd and saddest deaths in this sport happened. Wolfgang von Trips was one step away from becoming world champion in 1961. He was leading the championship with Ferrari, 4 points ahead of his teammate Phil Hill, and everything indicated that that day he was going to fulfill the dream of his life. But instead of a title, fate handed him a tragedy, one of the most chilling that Formula One has ever experienced. The previous year, the drivers and constructors had boycotted the race in Monza because they considered the circuit to be extremely dangerous, and it was agreed that in 1960 it would be the last time the race would be held on that track. Although in the end, the change was postponed for a year, a decision that would go down in history as one of the biggest mistakes ever made by the category. On the second lap of the race, Von Trips was fighting for position with Jim Clark. Their cars touched on the straight, and this happened. The Ferrari veered off toward an unprotected area, lifted off, and ended up going through a place packed with spectators. Von Trips was thrown from the car and the single-seater plowed through the crowd. The driver died before reaching the hospital at just 33 years old. And along with him, 15 spectators who had only come to enjoy the sport they loved so much also lost their lives. But the most disturbing thing of all is that the race continued as if nothing had happened. The organizers decided not to stop it. They argued suspending it would have made ambulance work harder. While tragedy unfolded in the stands, everything on the track continued as if nothing happened. In the end, Phil Hill won the race and with it the World Championship by just 1 point. But he only found out what had happened after getting off the podium. Von Trips was supposed to be champion in 1961, but his story didn't end with a coronation, but with his death. And the death of 15 innocent people who had only gone to watch a race. A tragedy as painful as it was unfair, and one of the darkest that Formula One has ever experienced. But before we get to the greatest tragedy in the history of the sport, if you've made it this far and you're finding the video interesting, subscribe. The 1994 San Marino Grand Prix is, to this day, the most tragic weekend in the history of Formula One. During that season, the atmosphere was tense and the drivers were increasingly questioning the safety of the cars. And many felt it was only a matter of time before a catastrophe happened. And unfortunately, they were right. It all started on Friday during free practice. Rubens Barrichello, a young, promising driver, lost control of his car, and this is what happened. He came out unconscious with a broken nose and a dislocated arm. The marshals saved his life thanks to their quick reaction. But this was just the beginning and a warning that the worst was yet to come. On Saturday during qualifying, Roland Ratzenberger lost his front wing after damaging his car on the previous lap. And without downforce, he couldn't brake his Simplic. He crashed at over 300 km/h and died instantly from a skull fracture in just his third Formula One race at 33 years old. The images were brutal, as television showed Ratzenberger dead with a broken neck after this tragedy. The logical thing would have been to cancel the Grand Prix. In fact, under Italian law, the race had to be canceled if a driver died during the weekend. But that didn't happen because beyond the negligence regarding safety, Formula One had economic interests that were too big to stop racing. The show had to go on, but what happened the next day ended up making the weekend the most tragic in the history of the sport. Someone who was deeply affected by Ratzenberger's death was Ayrton Senna, and he seriously considered withdrawing from the race. But in the end, he decided to race. Not for the points or the glory, but with the intention of dedicating the victory to his late colleague. And so we come to Sunday. Senna started from pole position. He was the idol of millions, a 3-time world champion, and still had a great career ahead of him. But while he was leading on the 6th lap, this happened. His Williams went off the track at Tamburello at over 300 km/h, crashed into the wall, and a piece of the front suspension pierced his helmet. And although he was airlifted to the hospital, he was declared dead hours later. He was 34 years old, and an accident that didn't seem so serious at first ended up being fatal. Formula One was shattered. Brazil went into national mourning, and the whole world watched one of the greatest of all time die in a race that should never have been run. Because if the drivers' complaints about safety had been listened to, Ratzenberger and Senna would still be alive. Or if the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile had respected its own rules, Senna would never have gone out on track that Sunday. The 1994 San Marino Grand Prix was not just a dark weekend. It was a chain of mistakes and decisions driven by economic interests. In the middle of it all, it led to a tragedy that changed the history of Formula One. And what I told you is just the beginning, because that weekend has many details that make it even more disturbing. So watch this video to find out why the 1994 San Marino Grand Prix was much worse than it seems, and how it changed the history of Formula One forever.